Welcome to our SIAH Public Life series, and thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today. It's a really great pleasure to have you with us. You're in Copenhagen at the moment, are you?
I am indeed, and thank you so much for inviting me to this interesting webinar.
Thank you. So, Helle Porsdam is Professor of Law and Humanities at the Centre for Interdisciplinary Studies of Law in the Faculty of Law at the University of Copenhagen. And she also teaches American Culture and History in the Saxo Department in the Faculty of the Humanities. So she is a really multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary scholar, and she did her PhD in American Studies at Yale, and she's been a liberal arts fellow twice at the Harvard Law School, as well as a fellow at Wolfson College, University of Cambridge, and at the University of Munich. And she holds a UNESCO chair in cultural human rights. And I'm really thrilled and delighted to be able to speak to you today. We've known each other for, I think, more than a decade now, on and off. We've had the wonderful opportunity to talk. And together with my colleague, Stephanie Jones, we will be thrilled to hear about the work that you're doing and more about how you understand the nature and notion of cultural human rights and what it does for us, or it could do for us when we're thinking about the future. So I want to kick off with trying to understand a bit more about what the UNESCO chair is and what you think is the importance and contribution of having a UNESCO chair at this particular political moment.
Well, thank you again for inviting me. Having a UNESCO chair is an honorary thing. You know, there's no money connected with this, but it's something you do. And I think there are about 350 or so of these chairs around the world. And the funny thing about UNESCO is that it has absolutely no power other than symbolically speaking. But since the areas that it covers are education, science, and culture, and communication, you know, the kind of people such as you and me that are a part of this are very vocal. So we having a UNESCO chair is as symbolic as it is, actually gives you a certain access to all kinds of things which have this symbolic power more than you would think it actually does.
What does it actually mean to have that symbolic power? I mean, when you talk about that, particularly in the field of cultural human rights.
Well, yes, I see it with my students, for example. As you mentioned, I teach in both the history department at the University of Copenhagen and in the law school. And both my history students and my law students, many of them or several of them would like to work with international organizations at some point, you know, the more idealistic ones among them. UNESCO is one of those international organizations that my students are really interested in, knowing full well that, you know, it doesn't pay well, but it has that kind of symbolic, vocal kind of thing about it, dealing with the kinds of issues that are important to many young people. So when I say symbolic power, it's not, you know, in terms of real power. It's more at the symbolic level of higher education, the arts, culture. You know, we all know that they have no clout as it is. You know, these are areas without any kind of particular political power, but there is a major symbolic power. And the people who work with these, within these areas are very vocal and are very loud. And so in that sense, we can talk about UNESCO having a symbolic power, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Helle. Actually, just thinking about this idea of symbolic power, I mean, many people have argued very strongly that rights are not meaningful unless they're attached to obligations and unless those obligations are attached to holders of the obligations. And that's something I know that is also concerning you a lot. So on the one hand, we've got this symbolic power that gives you a platform and a voice. How might that relate to this concern you've got about sort of identifying the obligations as the other side of rights becoming meaningful in the world, and the holders of those obligations? Does this symbolic power kind of help you to think about obligation as well as about rights?
Yes, it's obligations are that many human rights scholars are interested in that side of it, the kind of responsibility that you have, and in moral issues also as a whole. When you look at, for example, the European Declaration of Human Rights, many of the articles start out by outlining, you know, this people have this or that right. And then in the second part of the article, there's often talk about as long as it doesn't clash with the rights of other people or that of the general common good, for example. So rights are hardly ever absolute. There will be limitations to rights. And one major criticism that has been voiced towards the human rights regime is precisely that it only talks about rights and not obligations, or that when there is talk of obligations, it's what state obligations, you know, there are. States who have ratified this or that convention, what does that mean? You know, that in terms of cultural rights, the article that I am especially interested in is Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was not a legally binding document. So the intention within the UN community was always to have drawn up one treaty or convention that would make all the rights outlined in the Universal Declaration legally binding. Because people couldn't agree within the UN, we got two conventions in the end. And the one that makes the wording of Article 27 of the Universal Declaration legally binding is Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The big advantage of working with human rights is that these rights are not just about legal rights, they're also about ethical issues. You know, human rights always come with guiding ethical principles. And as a humanities scholar, I've been especially interested in working with the right to science, say, because science was categorized, for better or worse, by the drafters as a cultural human right. And that means that when we look at the role of science today, which is huge in all our lives, from the lens, you know, through the lens of human rights, we can talk about, for example, scientific freedom, which is mentioned in 15.3, together with artistic freedom, by the way, together with the kind of responsibility that this comes with. So from a human rights perspective, scientific freedom always comes with the flip side of it is always scientific responsibility. So I think it's inbuilt to a certain extent. And when we talk about Article 15, for example, the first part of it has 4 parts. And the first part of that has to do with outlines the human right to participate in cultural life and to benefit from scientific progress and its products, and also something called authors' rights. And then the other 3 parts of the article outlines the obligations that states have vis-a-vis making sure that their citizens get access to this right or protects this right.
Mm-hmm. And clearly that obligation is about an obligation to provide education. And you have described the right to education as the Queen of Rights. I was wondering, can you say a little bit more about what you mean when you describe that right as the Queen of Rights?
Yeah, well, it probably reflects the fact that I'm a professor. I think very highly of education to start with. But the first UN Special Rapporteur in the area of cultural rights put it very nicely, I think, that cultural rights are about furthering knowledge and creativity. So that is why the right to culture is mentioned always side by side with the right to science. It's about that. And she described cultural rights as transformative, and that rights that, you know, people can better their circumstances through these rights, and education is primary there, is one of the very most important ones. So through education, the idea is that you can better your circumstances, you can rise in the world, you will get better opportunities, you know, to get a better life as a whole. And that's what's behind these cultural rights as a whole, these 4 core cultural rights. The chance for a better life, the right to further human knowledge and human creativity.
That's really interesting, because I was wondering whether, when you characterised the right to education as the Queen of Rights, whether actually you were perhaps thinking more in the sense of a chessboard. You know, so you spoke earlier about the way in which rights are never absolute. They're always kind of in conversation with other rights. Sometimes that conversation can become a tension, a combat. And of course, a lot of people have written very critically of the rise and further rise of civil and political rights, and the way in which that hasn't just sort of glossed over those economic, social and cultural rights, but has actually diminished, you know, had the effect of diminishing the possibilities of social justice and of that access to social and cultural rights that allow kind of a greater equality in the global theme. So yeah, I was wondering whether that queen was also a queen on a chessboard, not just a queen as perhaps a figure of power. And sometimes those rights are characterised as, you know, negative and positive and first and second generation rights. And I'm really interested what you think about that kind of language. Is it ever useful? In what ways maybe is it distracting? Have you got thoughts about, I suppose this is an invitation to say a little bit more about those kind of interactions and tensions between those specific rights that you're particularly interested in handling and that larger kind of rights talk theme.
Yeah. Well, the right to science, as I abbreviate, you know, the right to participate, to participate, yes, but to benefit from scientific progress and its products. That's the wording itself. Is disadvantaged, I think, in 3 different ways. First of all, because of that unfortunate split within the UN, you know, as I said before, and as you know, the original intention was to have one document drawn up which would outline all the rights in the Universal Declaration. Once it was split up, you know, people have never ceased since then to discuss which are the more important rights, civil and political rights or economic, social and cultural rights. And in parts of the East, people would say the right to development, you know, one of those economic, social rights, more important. What's the use, they would say, of if you're starving, what's the use of having free speech, for example? Whereas most Americans would say that, on the other hand, civil and political rights are absolutely the core of human rights, and the rest of it is non-justiciable, it's political, it has nothing to do with rights. So the official UN stance on this is that they are, in the wording of the Vienna Convention from 1993, interrelated, interdependent, and equally important, all of them. And that's kind of the official UN point of view. And I would say I think most or many European scholars would support that. So they are equally important. And as I said, the first way in which cultural rights are, or the right to science is disadvantaged, is in the sense that for many scholars, the true human rights are civil and political rights, and the rest of them just don't count. And the second way in which they're disadvantaged is that when people then are interested in talk about economic, social rights, they talk about only those 2. They hardly ever mention cultural rights too. So there's even a concept for that, economic and social rights. And the third way in which the right to science is disadvantaged is in the sense that when people then finally do talk about cultural rights, what they mostly talk about is the right to participate in cultural life and cultural heritage issues. We hardly ever get to the right to science, which is, you know, along with the right to participate in cultural life, one of those important cultural rights. Recently, I saw a new textbook on international human rights law, and was thrilled to see that there was a chapter on cultural rights, but it doesn't mention the right to science at all. It's all about cultural issues. So I want to make sure that we remember the importance that the first special rapporteur in the field of cultural rights talked about the right to science and culture as one right. So they are together, these rights, and they support each other with the intention, again, being to further human knowledge and human creativity, you know, which both of them are there in both culture and science. So we are very much disadvantaged when we talk about, not very many people actually are aware of the right to science being a cultural human right.
So we live at the moment in a time of post-truth where there's a huge distrust of science.
Right.
Is this lack of awareness of the right to science implicated in a post-truth society? Or how does it relate to that understanding of what actually constitutes truth?
Yeah, it's a key question, and it's a very difficult one to answer. But it is my belief that the wording of Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that mentions 3 out of the 4 core cultural human rights is actually key to understanding so many things today, and allows us, the wording itself allows us to actually touch upon a lot of the issues that are up there for grabs right now. And I am horrified by the way in which, especially in the American context, anti-elitism and anti-scholarship has become a part of the culture wars. So, you know, if experts, scholarship, whatever, is just another opinion and nothing else. So why should we believe that? It can be deconstructed like any other thing, and there is no such thing as truth at all. So what has intrigued me about the history of human rights, this is something that my son is actually working with. When you look through the what lawyers call the travaux, you know, what went on as they were framing or drafting these major human rights instruments, it seems that some of the framers, at least, some of the drafters behind the Universal Declaration, for example, wanted science to be free, because what was involved in science was a bona fide attempt at finding the truth. So that was important for society, that was important for everybody, and the only way to move forward was to at least attempt to find the truth, knowing full well as we do what is the truth. But a bona fide attempt, at least, you know, to try to be neutral. When it came to the products of that science, then it was different. Then, you know, all kinds of limitations were due, but not on the attempt itself to find truth or knowledge for the benefit of everyone. And one of the wonderful things about the right to science and the right to culture being mentioned as cultural human rights is that they allow us to see these things and argue for these things as general public goods. And that's where sometimes intellectual property can be a problem, because it privatizes and takes knowledge, art, culture out of the public domain. So the discourse of intellectual property is a property rights one, whereas the cultural rights, human rights one is one of general public good. Two very different discourses and ways of looking at this.
So if it's about general public good, but we still have this skepticism of science.
Yes.
How can we use this to change a dynamic around it? I mean, and what does the right to science mean, for example, when we have these enormous global challenges, where, you know, climate change being, you know, perhaps the one that's at the top of the list?
Yeah. That's That's very true. My hope is that, you know, some scholars working with this would say that a part of people's right to science is actually the right toward or the right to have science-based or evidence-based policymaking. So if that is the case, you know, the right to, you could actually use the right to science in climate cases. Young people could say, you know, to their respective governments, as some of them are doing now, that you are ruining the future for us and you are not basing politics right now on evidence-based stuff. So my hope is that we can get through. I was very inspired recently by reading a portrait, I guess you'd call it, of Justice Elena Kagan of the U.S. Supreme Court. In this portrait of her, it was mentioned that she very consciously uses her dissenting opinion. She is, you know, among the three more left-leaning justices in a very conservative U.S. Supreme Court right now. So she uses her dissenting opinions to actually talk directly to the American people and to tell them, listen, we are in the same boat. And when the majority says this or that, what it really means is this or that. So she is using that public office that she has to try to talk to the American people and to say that we are stakeholders, all of us, in American democracy. And I find that very inspiring. If we in the academy could learn to talk to the general public along these same lines, you know, saying that, listen, we have this enormous mess right now in terms of climate change, COVID-19 pandemics, the division between rich and poor and all the other major problems. We are stakeholders in the academy along with our respective populations. We need to solve this together. Then perhaps, you know, the trust would return. If we could somehow say that we're on the same team, guys, you know, we're not working against you, but with you. Then perhaps in the best of all possible worlds that, you know, some kind of trust might be regained. And if the population get the feeling that what is happening in the academy is a bona fide attempt to be as neutral as we possibly can, to find, if not the truth, then that on which, you know, the academy has a certain consensus, that this is an honest thing and we're working together on this, then perhaps in the best, it would be my hope that we could people would regain some kind of trust in what's going on. But we also have to be very honest about things like dual use when we talk about science. We have to make sure that the fear that many people have of science right now, you know, what are these scientists doing to us? Look what's happening to nuclear arms races. Look at the trade wars between the US and China, which so much of that has to do really with technology and science. So how can we trust what's going on? I think we also have to be very honest that science can be, there is that danger of dual use sometimes. Also think of the life sciences right now, everything that's happening there. Recently we had Naomi Oreskes from Harvard, science historian from Harvard, visit during a conference we had in the fall at the University of Copenhagen. And she was telling us that in surveys of the US population, and now I don't know whether that would be the same for the rest of the world, but at least in the US, it wasn't so much a distrust of science that was the problem, but a distrust of what this science and this knowledge might be used for. If you are deeply religious, you will not want to promote parts of what's happening in the life sciences right now. If you absolutely believe in power being part, should be not, as you know, this is one of the big discussions in the US right now. Where does power lie? Does it lie at the level of the federal government and the courts, or does it lie locally with, you know, at the state level with the people? If you believe in states' rights, as it's called in the US, in the American context, then you tend to be very skeptical of whatever comes from the government. So it's more along the lines of what science does to my lifestyle and my values that's more than a distrust of of science itself, which is also very interesting for, you know, how do we communicate about these things. So I think honesty is important. We have to make sure that we do not say that we can solve everything when we can't. And we have to also acknowledge that there is disagreement within the scientific and the academic community about things. There is the possibility of dual use, but we're working on this together in the hope of actually helping here.
I love the way you sort of beautifully articulated the relationship between constitutional structures in the US and sort of discourses of honesty and the idea of science in our world, bringing all those three things together because they do operate together. Jo, I'm conscious we've got some really great questions appearing in the chat. So I was wondering whether, and I know you're very keen to sort of very sort of directly to get Helle to talk about her latest book. Do you want to take questions in the chat and then return to the new book? I'd quite like to get you to talk about the old book, but we might not have time for that.
Yeah, and why don't we, because there are some really lovely questions coming up in the chat about things that we've already discussed, and in a way they do lead into your most recent work as well. So Nikki Marshos, I'd be interested to know where Helle thinks the threats to cultural rights are coming from, and are those threats changing?
There are many threats to cultural life and to cultural rights, sorry. And it's in terms of the right to science, which is what I have been working on most recently. We're talking about one kind of threat. Just think of what's happening digitally for the time being with chat GPTs and AI. Just today, I saw that there are voices being raised now that we need a moratorium on this kind of research. So that fear of what is happening, you know, in the world of science, since I don't know about you guys, but I am not an expert on computer science at all. So what's going on, you know, that fear, that's one thing, I think. In terms of the right to participate in cultural life, it is the exclusion of migrants, for example, and their cultural rights. It's the attacks on fundamentalist attacks on cultural heritage. It's a lot of different attacks on people's identity and allowing them to be who they are and to exhibit their cultural heritage, for example. So it kind of, you know, depends on what cultural right we're talking about here.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is that this is a sort of very multi-layered, and I think it's also a very fast-moving area, isn't it? I mean, I was also really struck by the list of names who have asked for the moratorium on AI. Yeah. And it's as if we look at that list of names, and because of who it is, we feel, and that's designed to be like that, isn't it? That very influential list of names are telling us there should be a pause on this. Well, actually, for many of us, it's a complete black box what sits in there. So the questions then about the right to science and what we are actually entitled to know, because it is our human right, become very, very present, don't they?
It does. They do. And it's, I was in a meeting the other day where we discussed academic freedom. I sit on, you know, Scholars at Risk, the European part of Scholars at Risk. And we were talking about academic freedom, what that is. It's slightly different from scientific freedom, but they overlap very much. The idea came up to say that academic freedom should be extended to pupils, you know, primary, secondary education too, who actually have a right to know the truth. I have a student right now, for example, who's working on, this is the American studies part of me, American history part of me, who's working on certain religious communities in New York, for example, you know, who refuse to let their students learn anything but religion. They hardly know English when they're done with school. So does a democratic society have a certain interest? In this case, you know, the state of New York has an interest in saying, you have to, we have to teach our, this is a democracy, we have to teach our students secular things as well. It's education is really, really important here also for us to keep up with this. I mean, I'm with you on the black box thing. You know, how do we as humanities or legal scholars, how can we ever understand what's going on? But we need to make an attempt, I think, because, and of course, the other part of the right to science that scholars have been talking about is that does it give the general public a right to be in on policymaking when it comes to science and technology? And could that perhaps prevent the mere fact that citizen scientists are in on this, could that prevent the worst dual use kind of thing? We don't know what's happening in the world of science, and it's just moving so terribly fast. So yes, the right to know what's going on is important, but we also have to say that it's difficult because we don't know much science, many of us. It's difficult to keep up with. And law is always hopelessly behind technology. Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting thing, isn't it? The pace of science and the pace of thoughtfulness about science and the lags that will almost inevitably sit in there, yet the very present need for that humanities and legal thinking around that in real time.
Absolutely. And it's also when you sometimes when you hear the people behind AI and all this new digital stuff, they are grappling with the ethical parts of this. You know, how ethical is this, and how do we actually? So I think that's where we as humanities scholars and legal scholars can really make a difference. But of course, it means that we have to know, we have to care about what's happening and not just leave it to the scientists. And the idea behind citizen science and on the part of some of the special rapporteurs who've written about this is precisely that perhaps they can say, now, wait a minute, what's going on here? You know, what does this mean? What kind of effects will this have on our lives? Most people interested in technology are interested in the technology itself, and it's fantastic what it can do. So they sometimes forget that what are the effects going to be of this? You know, what difference will it make to people's lives and how people live their lives? And that's, I think, where the social sciences and the humanities have a big role to play.
So there's a question from Ryan Bishop about the extent to which scientists for hire by large corporations, for example, big pharma, big tobacco, oil, natural gas, have exacerbated the suspicion of elites and experts within academic settings. And have the professoriate actually been remiss about articulating its contributions to society to all levels, and also an exacerbation of the same populist levelling of all positions, which I guess links very much to this question about where do academics sit within that voice, and also in your own particular case, having that platform in UNESCO about the right to science.
Yeah, there are many different questions in there. So one of them has to do with the problem of funding, for example, private versus public funding. I am, and I guess you are too, paid by our populations. You know, we are public intellectuals in that sense. So we obviously, in my case, the Danish population has a right to know what they pay me to do. And increasingly, as funding comes from private sources, you know, the question is, will there be strings attached, especially in the life sciences, I think, increasingly. The whole move toward strategic research, toward what is they call it today? There's a term for that increasingly private funding bodies are used, the EU as well, by the way, that kind of challenge-based, that sort of thing, which boils down to strategic research instead of basic research. So as more of that, not in the case of the EU, obviously, but in the case of parts of the life sciences and especially, I would say, what does it mean when that funding comes from private sources? Are there strings attached? What about who owns this also? And that's where the IP, the intellectual property issue comes in. That's one part of it. And then what was the other? There was another part you wanted. The question had two or three parts.
So I think it was about so there was about the funding element,
Yeah.
and then has the professoriate been remiss about articulating its contribution to society, and then and then about leveling of the same populist leveling of positions.
Yeah. I think with the rise of social media, it's increasingly, many of us are reluctant to become public intellectuals because we know that no matter what we say, it'll come back to haunt us one way or another. So in the Danish university law, for example, it says that a part of what university professors have to do is to disseminate their knowledge. But for many of us, I mean, I think we've all tried, you have probably too, that things get twisted out of all proportion. You get hate mail afterwards and all kinds of things happen because of the social media. So increasingly, perhaps, we are reluctant to get too mixed up. And I also find that increasingly I'm asked about my own opinion about things, which I am absolutely sure doesn't interest, the Danish population at all, but my expertise I would like to give. So there is, that the academic stuff that we can share with others gets to be conflated sometimes with what do you think, with opinions. And that is, I think, very, very troublesome. So we should, yes, my answer would be that, yes, we should get out there more than we do, but it is difficult. And I've had several politicians say to me that just get over it and do it, and get used to the fact that you will be attacked because you have to. If you don't do it, who does? So just get used to that, that it'll be a terrible thing in your life, but it's a duty.
So I think we've just got time for one last question before we wrap up with and find out a little bit about your new book. So Kieran asks, does Helle think cultural development should be included in the UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals? And what does it mean for cultural rights that they are not already included alongside the goals for decent work, industry and economic growth?
Yes, very good question. Thank you. Right now, there's a lot of talk in UNESCO about what's going to happen post 2030, after the Sustainable Development Goals, after 2030, when they kind of cease, or we will get into how do we get cultural rights in there? I'm going to a conference in Vienna next week that will talk about this. How do we get cultural rights in there? When that is said, I would say that many of the Sustainable Development Goals already have a lot of science in them. There's a lot of right to science in them. So that part of cultural rights is pretty well, I think, covered already. But there's a conscious development now, or a conscious discussion within UNESCO right now to talking about how do we get those cultural rights into whatever comes after 2030. What is the process? How can we advance them in the best possible way?
Right, I think that's a kind of watch this space answer, isn't it? That we have to just see what develops in the coming years. And it's interesting that there is that move to kind of recognize that's itself, I think, quite an interesting almost zeitgeist that is happening.
And can I add just one thing? I'm in concretely, one of the things that I've been working with the Danish permanent delegation in Paris at UNESCO that I've been working with them on is a document that was published last year, the year before, on scientific, artistic, and journalistic freedom. Sometimes, when you say freedom of speech, certain countries will run away screaming. But if you call it maybe artistic freedom or scientific freedom, perhaps that's a way in. And also, UNESCO has done a lot on journalistic freedom, but not on scientific freedom or artistic freedom. So what can we learn by actually looking at them together? And that's been a very interesting, concrete way of working with this.
That's fascinating. But I'm so conscious of time. I'm going to hand over to Steph just to ask you a little bit about your new work and what you're moving forward, because that's actually quite a nice segue from the document that you're writing and the work that you're doing at the moment.
Yes, well, one of the really nice things about the format of this Public Life series is really asking you, I suppose, to reflect upon that kind of longer trajectory. And a little bit selfishly, I kind of wanted, as someone who works on literature and is interested in fairy tales, I sort of wanted to ask you a little bit about the book that you wrote a while ago now on copyright and other fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen and the commodification of creativity. And I was wondering whether you might say something about that book and perhaps how that book perhaps tethered or led to your most recent book that has just come out. But feel free to say just a little bit about the past book and a lot about the present book, or vice versa.
Yeah, that was a while back, but actually that came out of the HERA project. You, Joanna, too, had a HERA project, and my project was on concerned copyright and creativity. Because what happens when you copyright or patent things is that you take them, you make them, you turn them into private property, and people have to pay to then use that. So that's a very different way of looking at things, and it clashes completely with other demands for open access. For some people would say Hans Christian Andersen, for example, stole, and as did Shakespeare, as did so many others, from tradition, from folk tales, from all kinds of other stuff. And if you cordon that off, so to speak, by privatizing it and slapping copyright on it, then others cannot use it unless they pay. It becomes, it gets to be behind a paywall. So for creativity, again, freedom is of the essence. So that's what that book was about. And Hans Christian Andersen didn't have when he wrote, it was before the Berne Convention in the late 19th century. That was the first convention that actually gave writers some kind of copyright. But it's a two-edged sword because for many artists, they need to live, obviously. So copyright is a way for them to make a living. But from a human rights perspective, what we have in Article 15 is not is authors' rights. It's not intellectual property. And the first UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights said it in so many words that IP rights are not human rights. Authors' rights are different. They are about the right to be mentioned as the originator of this, that you were the one who wrote this, for example, and a certain kind of control over what happens to your work after you're done with it. So that's a different ballgame. And in some ways, those of us who have a job can at least say that open access is easier perhaps for us to do than it is for artists who do need to make a living. And sometimes it's also very problematic in the sense that within the UN system itself, from a cultural rights perspective, many would say IP rights are not human rights. But on the other hand, they are mentioned as precisely that in, for example, the Indigenous Peoples Convention. They have a right in copyright. So where does that leave us? When even within the UN system, they can't agree on this. So what I'm working on now, if I may, is scientific freedom. I'm writing a book together with my son and a couple of others on scientific freedom, which is, seeing all of this not from the public perspective, not on the part of citizen science, but from looking at this from the scientific community itself. It's one of the few safeguards we have in academia, I think, is precisely that: academic freedom, scientific freedom. It will clash sometimes with the general public's right to know, But there are certain things that are important, I think, from our perspective to get out there too, that the right to science is not just, or culture is not just about the people's right to know. It's also about the conditions, that we need to create that very science from which we can then have them benefit later.
Thank you, Helle. I think that's a really good place to stop. We could talk much longer. I'd like to wrap up now by thanking you for participating in this Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities Public Life series. I'd like to also take the opportunity, of course, to tell everybody about the upcoming seminars that are on in the next month or two. So the next one will be with Leila Khalili on the 25th of April, and then with Kate Crawford on June the 29th. And of course, in the light of conversations about AI, if you're interested in that, Kate Crawford would be extremely interesting to hear. And Leila Khalili is wonderful and very interesting speaker too. So I'd like to thank you once again and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.